Welcome back to AI Alternative Intelligence, brought to you by Data2X. Today, we're joined by Jac SM Kee, co-founder of the Newman Fund. The Newman Fund seeks to resource and sustain a feminist technology ecosystem. I'm sure you're all just as interested as I am in hearing more about what that ecosystem means. But Jac really has been an activist for a long time on issues around internet freedom, around gender-based violence online, social justice. I'd like to begin our conversation there. Jac, I know you're really interested in and have been studying two key areas, especially where women are concerned, which is political agency and social relations. I know it's a fairly big task, but could you kind of outline what are the major transformations that you've seen in those two areas as technology has become more ubiquitous? And perhaps importantly to the topic of this conversation, how has AI changed those dynamics, if in any way at all?
Thanks so much, Anan, for this question. I think in terms of how technology developments have really impacted on these two particular spheres in life, in terms of political life as well as in social and cultural life, as with any as we have witnessed with many different moments in technology developments, this has really afforded the opportunity for greater distribution of access to both information, as well as the ability to create knowledge and make meaning of the world, and to be able to express the specificity of your experiences and your realities. And while you look at this in abstract ways, it may not seem to be impacting on a large kind of political domain sort of a way, but what it actually does amount to is it transforms norms, and it transforms very specific, not only gender norms in terms of how, men and women are expected to behave, or if there are even just two genders, but also kind of what are the expectations on different kinds of social and political and material life, what are opportunities available for you. And as always, when there is a little bit of a catalyst of almost like a knowledge revolution, right? Like that's sort of what it is. And when you have that, then that will always be accompanied by another, it's accompanied closely by a sort of social transformation that follows this closely. And we've seen this a lot with our current moment of the tech development era as we stand. Maybe not moving towards the AI yet, but I've been doing this work for a long time. So I remember kind of starting on this in maybe the late early 2000s or mid 2000s, and sort of thinking through this work and seeing who has access to technology and who does not, and what difference it makes when you have access to technology, and how and what kinds of technology you have access to. And then that really impacts on your ability to also be able to participate in kind of defining who should shape technology, the role of technology in our lives, who should also benefit from technology, what are the gaps within that, and all of these sort of culminates to political agency in a much broader sense than just political participation.
I'm curious about this shift that you've talked about around norms. I think one of the stories of the last 15 years, perhaps, which was a kind of a digital technology revolution, a kind of ubiquity of technology kind of growing very rapidly, which was then accompanied by the kinds of political shifts that we saw in things like the Arab Spring and other kind of political moments. They were seen as sort of deeply linked. That is, the technology becoming more available, and then the political revolution then actually happening, or at least a potential political revolution happening in many places. But then, of course, there was kind of backlash, there was change, there was not always a kind of a shift towards greater liberalization, greater political freedom, greater political agency for minority groups, for women, for others. And so some of those norms kind of remained static in many ways. What's your sense of that story? Is that norm shift happening in the places that you're working?
Yeah, I don't think it remained. I think maybe two things. One is I don't think the norms remain static. I think it's a contestation of power. And I also would sort of, push back against the fact that availability of digital technology actually catalyzed the the sort of social revolution. I think it is a different kind of organizing infrastructure that became available so that more people could participate in organizing and coming together and expression and figuring out the kinds of spaces that they would like to be and to also, hold truth to power, right? And in a lot of these kind of different movements that you've mentioned as well, women have a lot of women have always been in the front lines of the organizing. And then very sadly, a little bit after, like almost like, post the height of the moment, a lot of times the kind of almost like women's leadership in these spaces becomes a little bit forgotten, and then we get confronted a little bit with the issue of gender-based violence. But um, deviating a little bit from what we're talking about, I do think that norm shift is happening and is very dynamic and is always happening and is always in this process of negotiation and exchange. And I think it's really difficult to see what this shift is unless in hindsight. And even though it's 15 years actually isn't that long in the larger scheme of things. But if you wanted to see something that is very specific of a norm shift, you don't need to look very much further than the issue of gender-based violence and how that has really surfaced as the current iteration of the fight against gender-based violence. I think, sort of carrying forward from the work that a lot of the previous generation of activists did in the Beijing Platform for Women, and sort of bringing forth the issue of like women's rights are human rights, making gender-based violence as a public and political issue. And then the current iteration is really on um, um, the current iteration is really in the point of being able to not only sort of connect with your community where you are through things like social networks and social media. I mean, there's a lot of critique around that right now, but I'm gonna recognize the role that it played when it did play that, right? So, for example, the many, many different kinds of germination and blossoming of movements in different parts of the world that got knitted together as what is being called so-called the Me Too movement, which is really like, agitating against this widespread normalization of gender-based violence in different industries, holding people with great power and great public visibility to account, organizing in these ways, being able to try and thinking through how to be able to both articulate what has happened, organize from online to street protests to really getting policy shifts and real deep cultural and normative shift to say this is no longer acceptable and not okay. And it's not always a clear 100% like, wow, now there's no more gender-based violence, nobody accepts it anymore. I mean, if only. But there is definitely a much lesser global tolerance of this being a thing that can just, pass, that it's okay. And we see this in many different spaces, sites, and locations.
Do you think that technology, beyond the sort of organizing principles that you talked about, just at an individual level, do you think technology has given women, especially people who might have otherwise stayed silent, a sense of agency, a sense of being able to kind of fight back on an individual level beyond the kind of organizations and kind of grassroots movements that have propped up?
I think a lot of these movements were individuals who then found connection through these spaces, right? I think that's also shifted the kind of like the form and the dynamics and the ways of organizing. It's not so much like it's only cited in the organization or only cited within like formally recognized networks and so forth. I think you see definitely a lot more informal coalescing and coalitions forming, and then that sort of sedimenting into different formats, and then organizing that happens across political kinship in different places and different ways of organizing. So for sure, I think the infrastructure definitely has informed and shifted how we organized and our ability to be able to see our own individual selves within a larger struggle in that way. Um, as long as, of course, the caveat of access, like access to technology and gender disparity in access, is still a very persistent and stubborn issue. And then not only access to technology, but the quality of technology that you have, and like, also different ways of being understanding its impact and being able to also shape it in a way that makes you feel much more autonomous and empowered, rather than sort of just being a passive user of what's available out there. But either way, um, it transforms things, not because it's awesome, but because because it is about an infrastructure of um, knowledge and meaning making, and connections between people. And because of that, when you have access to it, it it will have a transformative impact in one way or another. Yeah.
I think that's a great segue to the feminist principles of the internet, something that you were part of formulating. I encourage our audience to go and look those principles up. I'd love to hear a little bit about the kind of context for these principles. What were the kind of issues that you and your kind of co-conspirators perhaps were thinking of and dealing with that sort of prompted you to create these principles?
Actually, the feminist principles of the internet came about through research, and it was a research that happened quite some time. I keep forgetting the year, but I believe it was either 2008 or 2009. It's like, it's like a while ago, but it was really a kind of like groundbreaking research at its time, because it was working with researchers in South Africa, in India, in the US, and in Brazil. And it was looking at how internet technologies impacted on sexualities and gender. So really looking at this from the perspective of sexual rights and gender rights. And then through this research, so many different issues emerged. And then we convened a group of activists from different parts of the world to kind of just think through. So what does this mean? Like, in terms of, if we look at technology from this perspective, what are some of the key issues that will emerge? And we wanted it to be like a positive proposition, instead of one that says, this is the problem with technology and like, all of the critique. We wanted it to be instead, this is the sort of internet we want. And it's internet because it was 2008, 2009. It's like, okay, this is the sort of like, if we had a feminist internet, this is what we want. So it started with that preamble, like a feminist internet is, I forgot the actual phrasing now, but it's kind of like started that way. And then it is meant to be like a living document that sort of surfaces different principles and that emerges along the way. There was a group of us that wrote it, and then it got clustered into different areas like expression, economy, access, embodiment, and I think the newest one is environmental rights. It was something that Association for Progressive Communications was stewarding. I was part of that organization at that time, but it really was a process that was held by many. And then it sort of also got taken on by different activists who were part of that process, or who sort of encountered it in different places, brought it back to their communities, see what these principles look like for you. And then, did a bunch of translation, and also brought this to different internet governance processes. So initially, this was really developed in order to kind of have a conversation with the internet governance. I guess it's not a policy forming space, but it's a space to think about policy and how the internet should be governed. So the feminist principles of the internet was meant to be sort of like a contribution to that conversation, but to speak from it from the framework from our framework, from what it means to talk about this, from where we stand, from our experiences, from how we understand political analysis, and from the global internet governance. This was again brought to regional IGFs and then to like national governance spaces. It was also a way to sort of engage different communities to think about who should govern the internet. What is that political conversation? Because I don't think you can have this conversation just from the perspective of a user, or just from the perspective of somebody who makes technology, but also the kind of environmental conditions where technology is being made and its role in society. So that's kind of like where it landed. I mean, yeah.
I mean, your point that 15 years isn't a long time is a fair one. But looking back, it is about 15 years since, that early research created this.
Yeah.
What is your sense of how those governance dynamics have been shaped or shifted by that positive vision of the feminist internet that you all articulated? What I don't want to force you to give it a grade or anything like that, but what's your sense of whether this has been a driver of change and different types of conversations that would have happened without the principles?
I think it was very helpful as like an invitation for those who have not engaged with internet technologies as an issue, to begin a conversation about it. And because we were really prioritizing those who were most impacted and who were most excluded from these discussions, namely, of course, women and people in the larger majority world, and also the communities they work with. You're not even talking about the intersections around, able-bodiedness and sexualities and so forth. By framing it as by being able to use the feminist principles of the internet, often translated into local languages, as a way to convene conversations and to center your experiences and the impact of technologies on your communities at the heart of those conversations. I think the impact of it was unexpected. It was more of a field-building impact rather than a direct, policy advocacy impact. It meant that more people from more parts of the world who were impacted by these developments were able to have a conversation and to engage in dialogue about this. Whether or not in the end they choose policy as their domain for political engagement, it's a politicization process already. So wherever you choose to do your change work, you have this ability to or this framework to support you in your analysis and in your engagement in that sense.
You are shifting from the kind of perhaps this vocabulary that you've given people through things like the principles to something much more, I would say, tangible, or more kind of activist in the Newman Fund. Tell us about the Newman Fund and the kinds of resourcing that it's attempting to do in creating this feminist internet ecosystem. Tell us about the vision of it and really where you think it's headed.
Yeah, so the Newman Fund is as you mentioned in the beginning, I've been doing this work for a long time, like starting from research, organizing global campaigns like that, like field building stuff. But one thing that remained persistent is that the resourcing of this work is really challenging because it is work that is sitting at the intersections. So it's really, those who resource, say, for example, women's rights work will say, well, technology isn't really a political issue, so I'm not sure why, there's other issues to resource, so maybe later, but maybe this is a nice to have rather than like a critical thing to be paying attention to. And then those who resource digital rights work is like, oh, gender issues, there's women's rights people who's supporting this, maybe it's kind of not our thing. Or and then for a minute, I think most of the resourcing that was available was just focused and centered around safety and security. So whether this is in terms of addressing gender-based violence online, or it's about, digital security, but from a holistic and feminist perspective, it wasn't comprehensive. It sort of really didn't look at technology's role in the now, right? Like it really interfaces every single slice and aspect of our lives. So it really needed to be addressed in a much more holistic way, in a way that really looks at this as a broader overall human rights and social justice issue. And how do we begin to resource this in a much more, without everyone having to do a lot of somersaulting or bending over backwards to fit, right? It's like, maybe this piece of my work can fit here. So we wanted to ease that burden, we wanted to absorb that, not so that you can focus on what it takes to organize and to build the sort of movement infrastructures that is necessary to look at this from a broad way, to look at this from its economic impact, its environmental impact, its bringing in many different movements and communities to be able to engage and participate in this conversation as well. So that's kind of what Nubun Fund wanted to do. And it's set up in the early days of the pandemic, when we all had to move our organizing online, right? Like nobody could go to the office or sit somewhere and figure out. We all of us, no matter what we were doing, had to figure out what does it mean now to move all of our work on this infrastructure. So it felt like, okay, it's an opportunity. We don't have to, make such a big, we don't have to convince as hard that this is supporting, looking at technology as movement infrastructure is a really critical thing. So that's one way to kind of look at it first. So how do we organize? What are the tools in which we organize on? Who owns those tools and the data of those tools? How can we really be able to have a little bit more autonomy, or a little bit more freedom or creativity in thinking about these things that we are using on our day-to-day to work on different issues, the sorts of research that we have to do, the kinds of frameworks that we can stitch from all of our other work into imagining what technology is in our lives. Because right now, the vision and framing of technology is very narrow. It's like very defined by a few corporations. Really not something that could be... technology has always been part of human civilization, right? Like from the very beginning, but none of this is actually inserted into this conversation. So that's kind of what New Moon aims to do. We are we're an activist fund. We are located in movement. Many of us have been part of the feminist tech movement and is still part of different activist and feminist tech movements where we are. We are entirely located in the larger majority world. So that's also something that's very important to us, because we really want to surface the leadership of people in the larger majority world in this work, and to also resource that leadership, to sort of really address this imbalance as well. And we are really trying to slowly create... maybe the best way to put it is, we talked about this actually just yesterday in team. One of our teammates was recalling the first time she was in a space with other activists, and she's like, "Oh, I was under this huge tree in Bogota. And there was all these other activists around me, and there was all these other people around me, and I could feel the breeze because it's very cool. And underneath this big tree, I felt like I could be in a space with other people for shared rage, shared outrage, but also filled with the power and the power and the sense that we can do something about the situation right now." So then the question for us is, as New Moon, how are we nourishing this tree so that many different activists and groups can be standing underneath this sort of shared ecosystem to feel, oh, we feel this collective power and ability to, shape things and do things differently. And that's kind of where we're standing.
I'm curious about this notion of being at the margins, because it requires funders to step out of the margins and identify your priorities as their own. Requires you to go out and find activists and groups that might not even themselves think of them as being feminist technology focused organizations. How has that process gone? Who's giving you the resources, and how are you able to distribute the resources to the right people?
So with funders, that's a really good question. And I think I have learned in all of these different years is that everyone is an activist, or I just treat everyone as an activist. So wherever you stand, you must be doing this work, and we must be encountering each other because you are interested in some sort of social change and transformation. So with funders and donors, that's the conversation I have with them. What is the social transformation that you are interested in? And have you seen this part, like this particular piece around technology's role and impact on very specific, on broader communities that are excluded from this conversation? Do you know the really cool work that's being done in the larger majority world by all of these different groups? And that's kind of that's the journey we take together. And some donors are much more ready and willing to kind of step up and go, okay, we don't fully get it yet, but we get enough of it to support and see where that goes. And there are quite a few donors who are I think private philanthropy is much more able to do this rather than bilateral funders as it stands. Of course, just different ways of doing this thing. But that's kind of just having individual activist champions, even within philanthropy, is pretty critical on this. And I have to say, the feminists have been the feminists in these spaces have been much more able to much quicker and able to see, because it also impacts on the people that they work with much more directly. And also very good point on how have we been able to move these resources to the field, especially by those who don't really see themselves I'm not a feminist tech activist, I'm doing other work, right? So we had this open call in 2020, and that was our first open call. And we're okay, let's see who's doing work. We have this open call, and it's called Seed, Grow, and Sustain. And that means that in 3 different levels, we understand you to be at different moments in this journey of engagement. Seed would be, you're not really sure, you might have an idea, or you might want to explore a relationship, and you just want to be able to have the space and the capacity to explore that seeding. Grow is you maybe are doing some other work, say, for example, you do work on sex workers' rights, but then you're seeing the impact of technology on your communities, and you might want to grow that strategy a little bit more. And then sustain are those where like, okay, I've done feminist tech work. Like this is what I was set up for. And there's like a lot of groups who are doing this increasingly in the larger majority of people. So we did that, and we had an open call, and we got like more than 2,000 expressions of interest, which we then had to like shortlist and so forth. And then eventually we were able to support about 37 groups, I think. Actually, I should have these numbers in my brain, but I don't. Um, but right now we're supporting about 82 groups and activists all over the world doing different kinds of organizing, some of which are very, a lot of their work is centered around focusing on technology and their communities. So for example, a lot of partners we work with in Latin America looks at AI and feminist, a feminist take to AI and how this impacts on the environment or gender-based violence and so forth. And then some of them are really very new to technology, but want to kind of explore this with their communities. And we also see these as gaps. So, for example, groups who work on people with disabilities in South Asia, and that's kind of also like some of the partnerships. So it's a journey. We have an open call actually coming up this year. And so we're all like planning and preparing. And I think it will give us another moment to have a snapshot of, the like a sense of who's doing what kinds of work and the sorts of needs that is in the field, and how we can also use this this understanding and this opportunity to really be able to understand a little bit more in our conversation with philanthropy as well, and sort of bring this into their gaze so that they can also fund in ways that we cannot. But yeah.
Well, we will be sure to let our audience know about the open call. If you have links, we'll make sure that they can get access to it. I'm also curious about a phrase that you used about rage or outrage. There's plenty to be enraged about these days as far as technology is concerned. I would think. I want to focus specifically about on AI. There's so much uncertainty, so much transformation, both for good and bad, that technology has ushered in. Has you have the people that you're working with, the people that you're funding, has their conversation, the tone or the content of their conversation changed around this as a result of AI? And how are you pivoting your work as a result of that?
I mean, I don't think we're pivoting. I think we just see AI as like, this is the current moment where tech development is getting a lot of investment and a lot of energy and a lot of attention, which is kind of focusing everything into the conversation around AI. But that's by no means the only conversation. That's one of. But saying that it's one of because it's receiving so much attention, energy, and also investment, is having a lot more broader impact in the immediate and longer term. One way is like a lot of the funding for social justice work also seems to be on tech and social justice, just seems to be also like, what are you doing on AI? Like, can we add AI into what you're doing? But like, okay, thanks. That's important. But also that's like, AI is one of, right? But okay, got it. The second is we're also seeing a lot more research in this area, which is much needed and very, very critical, because it always starts with that. I find in technology, you really need to start to do the research from the lens and perspective of those who have not been included in the conversation. So what does it mean for this particular technology for, say, data workers in Kenya? And what is that gender dimension in terms of who are most of these people? What's their, existing social relations? What does that mean? And then there's a lot of research around sort of AI and the future of work and looking at the gendered impact of this as well. And I think there's an ILO research that came up just late last year that looks at the impact of generative AI on jobs, and women will be twice affected because of the kinds of work that will be impacted. So research is like one key piece where we're seeing this emerging. And one of our partners in the field have just partnered with IDRC, which is a Canadian donor, to do a kind of like a Latin American network So they had a call and they were looking at, okay, we are asking for feminist AI in whatever stage you are in. What is that? We want to see which, like, are you at seed stage, prototyping stage, pilot stage? What is your imagination of AI projects that could be resourced as opposed to all of the other things that's being looked at right now? And what is the modality for that? What is the creation of AI projects that has a different relationship to the environment, to the communities that it is, that is holding the work, its relationship to norms and social relations or to economic. So that's also like a really interesting thing that's emerging. And many of our partners actually do apply and adapt and create different kinds of AI programs, I think, to support them in their work and in their mission. So for example, um, hate speech classifiers in local languages that's completely neglected by social media companies because, it's too few people or they just don't have the capacity, but community need it. So then they built this using large language models, but with, input from their community. So there's also a lot of innovation and development in the work that they do, but um, it's kind of like, yeah, how do you, what is the conversation with this right now, at this particular moment in terms of your broader engagement with technology and AI being like one piece of this. But it is, yeah, the concentration, the real concentration of resources and energy and attention to this is something that I think really does give cause for concern. Because why just AI and why just this particular way of looking at AI? In fact, when a lot of the different ways in which AI has been shown, or immense computational power has been shown to actually produce really beneficial, broader results, is not the one that we're investing in right now. We're just investing in like generative AI. So it's also like, I don't know. I don't know, like, and there's so much research to show that this actually isn't very helpful for any of us in many ways, but that's the kind of bubble that we're blowing into. So, yeah.
I mean, I think this is a good place to shift, perhaps to the end of our conversation, something around a topic that you've been working on for a long time, which is online gender-based violence. Something that I'm struck by is, platforms like Grok AI that are accelerating or even changing fundamentally the shift, the kind of language we use or the ideas we have when we think about things like online gender-based violence.
Hmm.
To me, that's down to a kind of almost philosophy of the platform behind it, the structure of the platform behind it, and uh, those kinds of phenomena demand guardrails that seem to be no way part of the conversation today. How are you and your colleagues looking at this sort of lack of willingness to put guardrails around technology platforms, whether it's Grok AI or others, um, especially in the face of these issues that you've been trying to tackle for many, many years? Um, how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, I think that is a really tough question and a tough thing to deal with at this point because it's so connected to the entire life cycle of engagement with technology as a whole. Right. So you asked me earlier, like, what has the feminist principles of the internet been useful for? It's been useful for activists to have a conversation about how the internet should be governed and regulated because you need to have that articulation. And now you're in another phase where, like, oh, you should, like, unless you're an expert, you don't know what you're talking about when it comes to AI. Like, it's just another way to kind of like exclude you from a, like, sort of like a techno yeah, it's a way to really exclude people who are impacted from having that conversation at a meaningful level as well. Not to mention, I mean, last year to this year, like the seismic shifts that's been happening in the US and big technology corporations' role in this and their closeness with the current administration and all of the global use and dependency, and also not just use and dependency, but how we are part of the global supply chain for this industry in all of our parts of the world, but so far away from being able to define how this can be used or what are the specific guardrails. And even within US themselves, they are really also, trying to like do all these different things around uh court cases and thinking about this from IP law perspectives, or like trying all these different instruments and tactics you can in the conversation around guardrail. And in the meantime, in the EU, this conversation is happening. There's a few different kinds of policy regulation that's being that we are now trying to see what how effective they are and so forth. But that's also just like quite centered in the EU. And what can then tend to happen in the space when funding is quite scarce also in the last 2 years is, let's just look at places where there's opportunities for policy changes, and maybe only if you engage in the EU. So then you have a bit of a Brussels effect and you sort of cause disparity all over again. So how do you deal with this issue that has very specific sites of concentration of power in terms of the technology that's being developed, in terms of the sites where policies are also being articulated and developed, and then how that transfers to the rest of the world? And we sort of sit there and go, now we have to build up guardrails and have this conversation and build things up. It's actually very very challenging. Yeah, it's a very, very hard thing to try and do. And we've done this in many ways before the current moment by working with, say, the regional policy officers of some of these companies to great impact, actually, because, there was a point where a lot of this organizing actually led to the tech companies to go, we can't be having all this gender-based violence on our platform. It's really terrible. So how do we work with local activists to think through some of these questions, to get them into our policy, like our content moderation thinking, or so there was this infrastructure that was slowly being built before that just got decimated overnight in the last 2 years. So now you're kind of sort of sitting here going, is it about guardrails? Like, what is the what's the possibility here? If this is a conversation about, it's basically a conversation about the current trajectory of globalized economic models, right? Like how are we building our economies, our national economies in the current conversation in terms of where we land in the supply chain of AI? And then we have that conversation. I'm from Malaysia, so I'm sitting here going, we have an AI roadmap, but we are basically going to be data centers. We are going to be the spaces where you can experiment with new technology because there's no guardrails. And there's also a lot of data that's collected that has no guardrails that you can use to test on different things. So maybe that's where we begin that conversation. Just sit where you are at and then see, okay, where are we here in this whole supply chain in terms of and gender-based violence is allowed to happen because it sits within this space of exploitation. And it's an acute manifestation of this exploitation that's very visceral and very visible, but it's not outside of the ecosystem of exploitation that is happening. So if we need to think about how to build stronger guardrails in the defense of gender-based violence, we've got to think about how do we defend rights broadly within this ecosystem, and have that conversation as a whole. Because otherwise what can tend to happen is you can say, we're protecting women and children, so that's why we have this law. But actually this law gives the government much more power for surveillance or for XYZ, but doesn't actually protect rights at the end. So yeah, it's a complex one. It's a challenging one, but it's one that I think we are all of us who are engaged in this field in one way or another is already doing some level of work. We are beyond our first elegant step. Like we're already sort of elbow deep in this and trying to figure this one out. But one important thing in this work, for sure, is that it's not a single movement work or a single community work. It really requires a lot of collaboration across sectors and across communities and across movements to kind of figure out, what's the ask? Like, yeah.
Well, I think that call for collaboration in the face of complex challenges is perhaps a great place for us to end this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, of course, for the work that you're doing and what the Newman Fund is seeding the ground for. I'm looking forward to kind of hearing how that all plays out. And as I mentioned, I'd love our audience to kind of check out the Feminist Principle, check out the Newman Fund, and the call that you have coming up.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much for this conversation as
All
well.
right, yeah, that's great. Thanks for joining us.